Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you all for coming here. We really appreciate it. We know there are a lot of AI events to choose from in San Francisco, and so we're honored that you chose ours tonight. I'm Corinne Riley. I'm a partner at Greylock, where I invest in AI infrastructure and application companies. And I'm very excited to be here tonight with these 5 panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, which in my opinion, they represent some of the most forward-thinking AI native products out there. And what we're going to center today's topic around is how we should think about costs when it comes to building with AI, and how to manage the trade-offs between being at the forefront of innovation with spend and performance, and how to think about pricing strategies, especially as companies transition across various stages of maturity. And I want to especially thank Orb and Baseten for putting this event together and sponsoring this event. So a lot of people's hard work went into this. So thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to start off and have the panelists introduce themselves very quickly. They're going to talk a little bit about themselves and what their companies do. And we're going to jump into some prepared questions, and we're going to end with Q&A. So I'll start with Matan.
Hey, Matan. I lead the developer product at Writer. Writer is a full-stack Gen AI solution targeting Global 2000 and enterprises.
Hey, I'm Kshitij. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Orb. Orb is a usage-based billing infrastructure company, so we work with other infrastructure companies and lots of AI companies and help them bill their customers, so generate usage aggregations, invoices, financial reporting, and run across product engineering and finance teams.
Hey folks, I'm Josh. I lead up AI engineering at Airtable. Airtable is an app building platform. A lot of both very small, large companies. I think over 450,000 organizations, a lot of Fortune 100. And yeah, our job is to bring AI to those customers.
Hey, I'm Evan, and I'm one of the founders of San Francisco Compute. We sell really big H100 clusters, so the things you would use to train big, giant models, that's what we do. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tuhin. I'm one of the co-founders of Baseten. Thank you all for coming today. Baseten allows you to run AI workloads in production. We work with companies big and small. I've been around for 5 years now, and yeah, if you need access to H100s to run your clusters, please come to us.
Great. So the first question I'm going to ask is going to be a little bit of context setting and talking about the macro. We all know that there is a very high level investment into AI research, both at the lab level, at the academia level, but even at the individual company level. And the question is, for how much longer will companies be doing this AI as an R&D project before we can fully focus on, getting into putting this product into a revenue generating exercise and product? So I'm going to start with Tuhin, Kshitij, and then Josh, and I'll let anyone else jump in as they want to.
Repeat the question. I spaced out for a second.
So a number of companies, for a lot of companies right now, their AI projects are highly R&D focused, right? And we're only now starting to see companies like Writer and Airtable and others put these into actual products. For how much longer, do some of these companies really need to spend on that R&D before that they can actually get it into a revenue generating product?
Thank you. Awesome. I'll let Josh and Matan talk a bit more about this because they're the ones actually doing the work. But what we see at least is that actually the right thing to do is actually go straight into how can we improve products for your customers and go there as quickly as possible. Honestly, don't focus a ton on cost and figure out what experiences work for your customers. And then once you have something figured out and if you have product market fit for your AI projects, then it's time to start thinking about performance and cost. But what we would say is just like everything else is like go to market as quickly as possible because it is a new paradigm in how to build products. And I don't think anyone really has the playbook in what works and what not works, what doesn't work.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'll add to that is I think it does depend on what business category your solution is in. I think, if you're in a fairly well-defined business category like productivity tooling or communications, right? I think there is a cap to how much business value you can capture, and I think that's fairly well understood. So I think one factor you have to consider is you can spend a bunch on AI and you can blow up your costs, but if that's not actually connected to your go-to-market motion and the value that your customers perceive from your product, those two things diverging too much are going to cause trouble at some point, right? So I think as long as you're tracking closely to how do our customers think of the value that they're actually getting from the product, and the business processes you are making more efficient, I think that will go a long way. And I think that maybe the counterpoint to that is it's possible that in some of these categories, you completely change multiple categories of tools, right? You just like disrupt the business process. And I think that's my guess is that's where a lot of companies are heading, where they think it's not just a iterative improvement, it's something where they can make something 10x more efficient or just eliminate a class of process. And then I think your costs and price points can vary a lot more.
Yeah, maybe like at a high level, right? People like to talk about how much has been invested in AI and the money that's been generated, the revenue that's been generated off of it. But I think that's like too macro and not actually useful for people that are building products or both for themselves or for their customers. And I think once you start breaking that down, there's like maybe 3 layers that I see. There's like the foundational or infrastructure level companies, there's the more product focused companies, and then there's actually above that just internal tooling being built to deliver AI for your own team. And I think that on that last category, there's actually a ton of ROI already generated. It's not as like easy or fun to talk about because it doesn't simplify as well. But like that's the thing where it's like today, I think companies are getting value, right? People are already building their own ways to do that with mixed success. But I think we have stories with customers where they'll save $500,000 a year on some single AI workflow that replaces some agency spend that they were doing. And so that's happening already, and I think that a lot of people need to be thinking about that. At the product level, I think that, we're going to see a lot of winners and losers, and so that's going to be harder to tell where the ROI comes out. But so I'll say like the lower down the stack, the less I know. But like the more on the internal cases, I'm very bullish.
Can I give a hot take?
Yes.
If you're training models, scaling laws are real. And so if you have an equation that says, spend $1 million and you beat all your competitors and you make this like incredible science fiction project, you should spend the $1 million. And you should like raise the money and do it because like training models is not the same thing as like traditional R&D where you're not actually sure. If you have a literal equation that says put money in, get like godlike product out, you should just do it. You should totally do it. So far, basically every AI success is like pretty much that. There's also a lot of like people who've lost doing this, but like also all of the like successful AI products are like some variant of this, or at least it came from that, at least at the training the model layer. Just the point is that if you're going to do this, you should like optimally spend that money and not just like blow it in the way that I think a lot of startups end up doing, where they get convinced to take a very large round and then, kind of blow all the money.
I like that. That perfectly segues us to the next theme, which is more on COGS and margin specifically. So as model sizes and training costs obviously increase, as Evan was saying, how should we think about the trade-offs between performance and cost? And more importantly, how do you communicate these trade-offs to your customers versus make them implicit in the product experience? So I'm going to start with Matan on this one, and then go to Tuhin and Evan.
Okay, well, I was about to say I spaced that for a second too, but I think I got the gist of the question.
Do we want to start with Tuhin?
No, it's okay. I think it's kind of related to what we said a second ago. Models are a commodity, or most models are, and at any given point in time, any company in the market is 3 to 6 months ahead or behind the rest of the pack. There's no secrets. Everyone knows what everyone else is working on, more or less, whether it's like a strawberry or a banana or whatever name you want to call your model. And that's okay. That's what research is all about. And I think Where you really start deriving like strong economics as a company is moving away from just purely charging on a model usage basis, but actually providing outsized value to your customers, because then you can start charging things like variable plus fixed costs. So for example, I'll use Writer as an example. You have like an annual contract plus usage. And I think you can start being really innovative on your pricing model. And as long as a lot of these companies in the AI space stay in the usage layer, the usage plus percentage on top, A, their margins are very thin because they don't own a lot of them don't own their models. And B, they're not really, they're essentially a wrapper to the foundational layer. So, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, it's necessarily in the short term, but you really need to find your hook and what's differentiating to you, and then you can really drive revenue through that versus just being like, okay, I just did a X on top of like, I don't know, Anthropic or OpenAI. And this is also why the Airtable example is really relevant, because in enterprise, especially in internal workflows, it's not sexy, but there's a lot of money to be made and there's clear ROI. And because it's not sexy, people don't want to work on those set of problems. So if you really find those wedges, there's a lot of opportunity and high margin to be made there.
I'll just comment really quickly on I think the way you communicate the pricing is really important. Like, we work with a lot of customers who are thinking about their pricing models, and I think if you are just framing it as a marginal cost at an API request or a compute second, now you have the project of explaining, why is it marked up, this percent versus this percent, whereas if you have a baked platform fee, at least you're forcing the conversation of, what am I getting that is in the business logic of your platform? And I think that is actually a really important framing in the, price communication.
Yeah, I think that all resonates. I think, we're an infrastructure provider, and so our model is slightly different because, we are providing compute or allowing you to use other compute, and, the economics of that is fundamentally quite different. But for our customers, at least, what we see is that you actually want to be as detached from, the underlying costs as possible. I think if you think about, maybe we can use the example that we all know, maybe like Perplexity. I don't think users care what model's running under the hood. You don't think about how many tokens are being generated. You think, hey, I want to search. Does it do a good job? And so actually focusing on quality and what does that ship, and then figuring out, I feel like your margin is your problem, not your user's problem. And so, but I feel like that's a secondary concern. And obviously when you do need to figure that out, come to Baseten, and we'd love to help you optimize using your compute and speed up your models. But I think actually aligning your products with the value you're delivering as opposed to your own cogs is pretty important off the bat. But I think that's what everyone else is saying too.
Okay, and the next question is specifically for Kshitij, which is, where on the maturity curve do we see margins being addressed for businesses, especially based on what you've seen with Orb?
Yeah, I think AI companies, it depends on the place they are in the stack, of course, but I think are thinking a lot more about margins than traditional SaaS companies. I guess we started Orb when, of course, AI was a thing, but Gen AI hadn't exploded, and I think we were working with later stage companies, Series B, Series C, starting to think about billing and revenue as a exercise they had to now start undergoing. And now we work with those companies, but also earlier stage companies where they have to think about COGS on day one. And I think that's coming from a couple different places. One is, even if they're not super focused on the exact dollar margins, they have to think about how they scale over time. So just the scaling axes are important. And it's possible that they're using some other foundation model and the price gets cut in half or tenfold overnight, and that happens. But still, if your product is architected in a specific way, it's still going to scale in that fashion. And then two, I think it does matter that the macro has shifted. We are not in 2021, and I think that means that when you're raising money and talking to investors and it's a competitive market, there is a lot more focus on, are there favorable unit economics, and do you have some sort of architecture advantage that other players don't. And so I think, there's this thought of your margin is my opportunity. I think people are going to eat your cake if there is no advantage and you're really just like marking up something else that's a commodity.
Just one thing on this, on what Tuhin also said, is one thing we're seeing, which is very difficult, is unlike before AI, I spend a lot of time in fintech, for example. In fintech, it's very clear what you charge. You have transaction fee, someone comes to you with their transaction history, and you can tell them exactly what's the usage going to be, and then you kind of like price that, give them some volume discount, and congratulations, you won the deal. I think what happens with AI, there's a lot of uncertainty with organizations where they're like, so how much is this going to cost me? And a lot of times we don't know. So you're asking them to do a commit, and you're like, well, you might wake up one day and be surprised. And that actually happens to a lot of companies. They're like, holy shit, what just happened to my compute bill? And I think that's a very scary prospect to any CIO or IT person you've ever spoken to like make that plunge. And anything you can do to help them with that would go a long way.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is happening a lot more is like because the landscape is changing so rapidly, people also have to be ready to change their pricing very quickly because you can be locked into, like, let's say you're selling to an enterprise customer, maybe they've committed to $1 million, $10 million in spend over the course of the year, but if now everyone's prices go down, they expect their burn down of that commit to proportionally go down. And I think that sort of dynamic wasn't as present and it's probably still not present outside of AI. And I think that's partially because there's wide knowledge that when prices go down, the industry needs to shift pretty quickly to that.
If you are trying to sell a product and delivering business value, right? Talking about margins, I think is hiding. Like you could have negative 100% margins, and if you're like delivering real value and the price is half, I guess, you're at zero, right? And like that's fantastic. And if the price is half, the cost half again, you're at 50% margin. And so I think like yes, you do have to assume these costs are going to exponentially drop. But like if you're worried about margin, that kind of thing, I think the core value that you're offering might not be there.
And so maybe that's a good segue into the next question, which is about, and I'm going to have Josh answer this, and then Tuhin, and if anyone else wants to chime in, which is, how do you trade off in the short term, right, in the tactical short term, staying ahead of competition while at the same time minimizing costs and adjusting for, right, the cogs of building the product?
So my answer is very heavily based on like selling enterprise SaaS, right? And so when we're talking to our customers, it's really, you have to start with like, what value are you delivering to them? And we're trying to deliver value on the order of like millions of dollars, right? More than that if we're only taking like a small cut of that as revenue. And so for our customers, I think the biggest problem is they get caught up in the conversation about tokens and credits and like, oh, how much am I going to burn? And like, well, you bill me again this next quarter if it goes like, you're not going to use up all these credits, right? But as a customer, you're like, okay, I don't really trust just saying that. So if anything, I would rather try to remove that from the conversation and be like, this is such a valuable use case that like there's no way that the AI cost is going to get there. I forget what the question was, but I think what I said was relevant.
I think you answered it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have too much out there. I think that seems right, which is like, we again, our business is a bit different because we align pretty heavily with underlying costs. But even for us, like the way we talk to our customers is about value. It's about time you'll save if you deploy base 10 versus others. I'd say for our customers, it's slightly different because I think it focuses a bit more on outcomes for them as opposed to their own cost, which is like, hey, what value am I driving? And if that value is big, I think like one of the big things you see right now is in call centers, right? So AI is coming into call centers, and the value is massive. It's we talked with the enterprise just last week, and they said that for one single use case, the saving was about $1.5 million, and that was one of I think 13 or 14 different use cases just from using an AI-powered phone call for a very specific. It was a car rental company, and they said that they have, I think it's 4 to 5 headcount in each major region dedicated to calling people up to return the cars. And so it's like, hey, where are you? This is how far you are. This is how much time you have left over. And so they were like, hey, we're going to go from spending $2 million a year to around $500K a year using AI. And I think that value is really, really obvious to them, and it's kind of devoid of the underlying cost.
I mean, I think like you mentioned Perplexity, we help Perplexity with their cloud billing, but I think that's a good example of like, there's two motions there, right? They have, you use Perplexity as a product, you pay, the pro subscription, $20 a month, but you use Perplexity as an API, you pay per token, and you pay somewhat related to the underlying cost basis. And I think in neither case can you completely ignore cost, right? I think in the case where you're paying $20 a month, there are safeguards and limits in place such that you can't completely blow up their margins. And I think maybe there's bigger companies who perhaps have less safeguards, like I think Slack charges $20 a month for Slack AI, or GitHub charges, whatever it is for Copilot, which is a fixed fee per seat. And I think in those cases, those companies are just willing to swallow the cost for now, even if they have some subset of customers that are really heavy users, because over their entire customer base, it doesn't matter as much. And my sense is like, they don't need to switch to a cost tracking model anytime soon. But that's kind of a luxurious position they're in at this point in time.
I'll say, I was dismissive somewhat, but in reality, short term, like, it is a real problem too for like companies like Airtable, right? Like, how do you make sure abusers, especially like the long tail of like self-serve users, right? Like, with bad actors there don't end up just blowing up your OpenAI bill. And so it is so there's a lot of like abuse, but then we treat it like any other abuse problem, right? Making sure that you have the right limits in place to track that. Great.
So the next couple of questions are specifically about pricing strategy. So I'm going to start with Evan, and then anyone else chime in here. But if I'm a startup founder, I'm building with AI. The inputs into the costs that go into for me building with AI are constantly changing, and there's many different parts about this. I think Josh alluded to this as well, right? I have my primitives, my storage and compute. I have like the architecture of how well I'm putting this all together. I might be building my own dev tools internally to make it work. And then I have my third-party providers as well. How do you, like, what leeway is there in managing these different inputs? And how should one think about managing these inputs when thinking about growth and also pricing for their product?
So I'm going to talk about compute because that's what we do. Pretty much every GPU cloud in the world wants to offset their inventory risk. So they went out and they got like a loan, and then they racked and stacked a bunch of nodes in a data center somewhere. And now they are like burning $40,000 a day. And I don't know about you all, but I don't like burning $40,000 a day. So instead what they do is they make you burn $40,000 a day. They go to you and they say, hi, please sign this year-long contract, or maybe 3-year-long contract at a fixed price, because they don't like the variable thing where they're not sure who is going to buy the next month. If they only sell you a month, or if they sell you an hour, who's going to buy the next hour? They're always worried about the next hour. Wait, what was the total question for a moment? Oh yeah, right. Like, how do you actually? Yeah, okay. So my general recommendation is that if a GPU cloud comes to you and says, "Hi, please sign a year-long contract with us," unless it is base 10, you should say no. If it is base 10 and base 10 comes to you and says that you should sign a long-term contract, you say yes to this man. This man 100%. But everybody else, if Lambda approaches you or CoreWeave approaches you, you should tell those hedge fund people to screw off. Can I swear?
It's okay.
Okay, yeah, you should tell them, no? Okay, I cannot swear. Okay, you should tell them to politely go have a great day. And instead, you should do a different thing, which is you should use a compute market like San Francisco Compute, which allows you to place buy orders and sell orders. And that means that if you want a fixed price for some period of time and you want to factor that in and you don't want to have to deal with the variable price, you can buy some amount of compute for a fixed price over a period of time, but then if you want to leave, you totally can do that. You can just sell back your compute on the same area. And the other nice thing about a compute market is there's a whole bunch of people who are burning $40,000 a day, and they don't really like burning $40,000 a day. And so what they do is they sell it at below cost. They fire sale their clusters, which means that if you buy from somebody like San Francisco Compute, you can get H100s at like $1 an hour, which if anybody knows the underlying cost of H100s, that is not the underlying cost of H100s, in fact, below cost of the underlying cost of H100s, because otherwise, you're burning $40,000 a day, and you like to not do that, and so you're willing to only burn like $30,000 a day or $20,000 a day. I don't remember if that.
That was great. And you can use the remaining 10,000 on AI events.
Yep.
Okay, the next question is specifically for Kshitij. And I want him to answer this question on behalf of all AI customers out there, is what my document says. So which pricing models are most common that you're finding customers of Orb, or just customers you talk to in general, use? And does that differ at all across different segments of size of customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple people have mentioned this already, but the pricing model, perhaps to no surprise, that we're seeing a lot more people use is some form of prepaid credits for a couple of reasons. One, I think you get a single discounting lever, right? You say, great, I'm going to give you 10,000 credits for a dollar cost basis instead of 150, and then my list rates for any type of model or GPU or compute cluster are going to vary over time, and they're going to change day to day, but I'm just going to give you a discount on the credits. So I think it actually makes your selling motion easier. There's also a bunch of other reasons to do it. I think it lets you introduce mechanics that probably people are aware of from folks like Snowflake, where you can roll over if you want. You can roll over based on some utilization of credits. And so I think it makes generally the conversation with the procurement team also easier. I think in general, the trend we're seeing is companies want to minimize the amount of credit risk they're taking on. So prepaid credits are one way to get the cash flow up front. It doesn't necessarily have to be all paid up front, but it's not just being paid every month. And another good example of this is we have lots of companies that are worried that if they're just making their customers pay at the end of every month, someone signs up, maybe their credit card is good, you make an authorization charge, they rack up $20,000 of usage, and now their credit card doesn't swipe, right? And now you're in trouble because you're out whatever the dollar amount you paid for it is. And so there's various mechanisms to get around that, but prepaid credits is one of them.
Awesome. So the next one is going to be specifically for Matan and Josh, and then if anyone wants to jump in, you can. We're obviously very early in AI products, right, facing the wider consumer and enterprise base. How should we think about pricing as it relates to, like, Josh, you talked about, you can prove enterprise value, but given we're very early, do a lot of customers believe that enterprise value exists so early on? So is it better to land, prove value, and expand, or how can you get like larger contract size up front? And Matan, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Josh.
Okay. So there isn't an easy answer. I'm sorry. What we've seen that does help is, yes, land and expand. I think there's a real problem now in AI on the expand side. I think there's still, most companies have not proven they can do it on a regular basis. But at least in like a 6 or 7 figure contract, multi-year contracts. But I think what it comes down to is you come in, you find especially I'm talking about enterprise, by the way. I have no clue about consumer. I have opinions, but no clue. You come in, you find an executive sponsor, you work with them, you identify with them, you try to identify literally the hardest problems in the organization. Because if you can solve those problems, you're locked in. Then at the end of the day, and when I say an executive sponsor, I don't mean like a mid-manager or a director even. I mean like VP, SVP, EVP. And the reason is because what you're seeing that happens a lot in enterprises, when they talk to you, there's an inherent tension in the org. The senior leadership cares about outcomes. Mid-management cares about continuing education. They see you as the AI vendor or the AI tool. They don't want to bring you in because they want to build this in-house, because they want to say that they've built an AI platform on their resume, because they think when they leave, they can bump their base or the total comp by a few $100,000. So there's an inherent tension. So this needs to come top down, usually. And then as you work with them and solve those hard problems, you start with a single or let's say 2, 3 use cases like that. You price them. you prove your value, and then the doors are literally open. And by that, I mean it opens to the executive suite, to the board, and then you just like ramp through and can capture like a massive share of wallet for that organization. But it's a very slow process. This is not like a one and done. And that's why you see a lot of the foundational companies are struggling, because they started as research, they went to consumer, and now they're dabbling in enterprise, and to sell to enterprise takes more than just like a great model. There's a lot that has to come around it, especially the sales motion, that they're not equipped yet to do.
Yeah, took the words out of my mouth. Like, there's land and expand on use cases is how I would think about it, and you still have to land on a really important use case. And so, with Airtable, it's also interesting because we have our main product and AI as an add-on, but in a lot of our conversations, right, we are very interested in expanding to net new teams because the add-on as a percentage of our base seat price is much smaller, right? So it's expanding across, like, if you look at a Fortune 100, you land on a 20-person, 50-person team. How do you get that to 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 seats? But the security and legal review at these companies, from what we're seeing, from what we're hearing from others, is just so long, even for the most exciting use cases, where it's like, hey, this just saves us $2 million a year. Great, let me put this through a 6-month review. And so that's very real today, and so that's why you can't land on a non-trivial case. And so where that ties to pricing is we're not trying to, extort a massive premium, but we are trying to charge fairly for the value we're delivering, because I'm a broken record on this, but like that is really what's still important here. So there is just no case where it's like, let me just tire kick this, see if it's fun and interesting, and let it turn into a real use case, especially in the enterprise.
Can I just add something
Yes.
there? I think that seems right. I think the exception there, Josh, is what we're seeing with some customers and writers around these customers where they're going to enterprise and saying, we'll deploy on your premises. And those are moving very, very fast. Like sales cycles, like Matan can talk more about it, but it's companies like Accenture buying in sub-quarter timeframes because you can skip all the security review, all the legal, and have a much laxer legal process just by saying, hey, no data is going to leave your premise. I think there's other examples there as well, like Codium is on the Cogen side. And that's, if you do want to attack enterprise, that is it is probably the quickest way to get in today if you can get around that security posture up front.
One thing in the enterprise space on that is a lot of companies, most people here seem young, so they don't remember cloud, but like when cloud started being a thing, but there's still companies that migrated into cloud 20 years into it. And part of the problem that people need to remember with enterprises is that change management is very hard. That's why Accenture exists, to help them through this process and get that change management in the org. One thing we found to be extremely effective is essentially AI program management. As part of us coming in, we literally have, Palantir might call it forward deployment engineers or whatever, but like the point here is these are people that work with you alongside sales and account management, and they're actively pursuing these new cases, existing problems, new use cases, and are essentially the champions, your champions inside Writer in our case, and Writer's champion inside your organization. And some of the work they're doing internally and as well as in the organization on what does it mean to deploy, how do you deploy it, how do you scale it, that's what it takes, and it's not sexy, but it's hard work. And again, this what makes successful in enterprise compared to just like a shiny technology or a great pricing model, is doing that grind and day in, day out, being on site with these people and making sure the product works.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll add to this change management point is one thing that still matters selling to the enterprise, especially larger enterprises, is you need to be able to talk to procurement teams. And I think one thing that's actually been a big change, I think industry-wide, is only going to continue is, when you talked about something like usage-based pricing is popular in places like fintech, but in general, you'd get in front of a procurement team and they're like, we have no idea how to project this. Like, what the hell is an API request, right? And now I think with some of these foundational AI models, But in general, usage-based pricing being more common, that is a pretty stark change, which is procurement teams are getting to the point where they understand, okay, this is not going to be a fixed spend every month or every year, that we're going to have to project this, and we have the tools to do that. And I think that's bleeding outside of, buying just AI, but all sorts of tools. And I think that's maybe the underlying change that needs to happen no matter what if you're going to be able to sell these pricing models to big enterprises.
Great. So for the last theme of tonight, we have 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. So the last 2 questions are a little bit higher level about the philosophy around building with AI and organizational structure of teams when building with AI. So the first one I'm going to ask Josh to answer, and then anyone else please chime in, both regards to the companies you work at and also customers that you've worked with. So as Matan mentioned, many people may want to work at a large company, say that they built the AI platform internally and put it on their resume and get a great job next year. And so we have this dynamic where there's centralized AI teams that are managing a company's and a product's whole entire AI strategy. And then, some companies are taking much more pinpoint, I have an AI team that is specifically working on this one product. Have you seen anything, what have you seen be very successful from a team organizational perspective of centralizing the AI team versus using, having people be much more nichely focused?
I think it varies. I think where the conversation changes, it's what does your company need? And for some, they're in a pivotal moment where AI might substantially threaten how you're doing customer support or selling a customer support solution, right? So in that case, it might make sense to centralize that. I think within Airtable, even we have teams outside of my direct team that's working on AI as well. And I think for a lot of companies, it should look more like that, where it's what are the use cases you're trying to deliver here? What's the value you're trying to bring? And so that applies to internal IT tooling, right? AI centers of excellence, trying to make those changes across the IT organization. That applies to bring that into certain products. That applies to doing research that you want to do fundamentally. So I think it's you still have to just really come at it from a first principles perspective. It's is the right thing to shock my org into saying this is really important, we need AI, or is it let's just have some folks start looking into this, and because not every product needs to have AI.
Anyone else? Okay, this is gonna be the last question, and then we're gonna open it for Q&A. So if you have some questions, start thinking about them. So the last question, I'm gonna start with Matan. He's excited, and then open it up to everyone else. So to our dismay, models are still non-deterministic, and it is very difficult to predict and understand the impact of how AI is gonna work actually in production. How do you think about the trade-off between using a generalized LLM versus a more vertical specific or use case specific model? So I'm gonna start with Matan, and then anyone else, please chime in.
Yeah, so I'll do a plug and then I'll answer the question. The plug is Baseten is great. We use them for all of our models, and our models are both generalized but also vertical specific. Writer has, our models are called Palmyra after the ancient city in Syria, and we have Palmyra Med, Palmyra Fin, and Palmyra X, which is the general model. Why Med and Fin? Because generalized models are not good at certain things when it comes to numbers, when it comes to concepts around financial concepts especially. Why Med? Because we have very large customers in the healthcare space, some of the largest healthcare providers in the world. And again, LLMs are not good. They don't understand basic concept when it comes to pharmaceutical, to medical, and they require more domain-specific knowledge. Now, those customers, the fact that you're a healthcare company doesn't mean you will not use the Fin model. And that's not what it means. They have strengths and weaknesses. They might chain of thought those models depending on what they need to build. But our belief and our philosophy as a whole is we don't think there's going to be a universal large model that's going to cost $100 billion. We just don't buy that. We think like the same way that you don't go to your dentist when you want to fix your car, you're not going to use a generalist model or a med model when you want to deal with financial concepts. And within med, you'll have different, like, you'll have a vision model for radiology and like cancer specialists and so on, the same way you have with your doctors and so on. That's our belief. That also allows us to have these models outperform any and all benchmarks which are specific to those domains, because then in a domain-specific model, it's actually quite easy to get to. If you look at models today, they hover around the 80, 85, 86 on the benchmarks. With domain-specific, it's actually quite easy to get to 95, which is way above human capabilities. Just one example, the Palmyra Fin was the first model to ever pass the CFA exam, CFA 3. And it also allows us to cut costs on those models. So I think this like checks all of these boxes. So when I come to a company, let's say a large medical insurance company, and given those use cases, I have an arsenal that I can work with and say, for your insurance claims, you should probably use this model versus that model. And then I provide them that advice, and then whether or not we build it or they build it themselves, that's a separate orthogonal conversation. But it really helps them solve the problems that they are facing. Unlike a approach which is like one size fits all. That's, I guess, the tack we chose to take, and it seems to be working so far. And we have a bunch of other domain-specific models coming. Well, it depends on base 10, but they're supposed to be coming soon. No, I'm joking, but they're coming in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, that's basically what we decided to do.
Next couple of weeks, Tuhin?
Sure. I think that seems kind of aligned with what we're seeing as well, which is that, look, I think all the models are great. You know, the general purpose models are fantastic. They're also quite expensive to run at times, and they have, you know, the security requirements and so on and so forth. And I think like fine-tuning something to something a bit more domain-specific just allows you to maybe, you know, hone down on how good it is, something very specific, but then also allows you to save on quality and costs. If you can distill it down to something smaller, you can run it in something smaller, you can have control over it, and so on and so forth. But I think the truth probably is it's a bit of like a little bit of this and a little bit of that approach, which is like, you know, you're going to use general purpose APIs and providers for maybe anywhere between like, you know, 50 to 90% of your workflows, and for those, you know, really special use cases that might be the highest value use cases, you're looking to doing something a bit more domain specific. And I think that's the approach that you know, Ryder and a lot of these cogent companies are taking.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to open it to Q&A. Are there any questions? Right there. They're going to come with the mic. Please hold.
This is a question for Kshitij. So I'm curious, when you do billing management, is it so that there's also this debate around outcome-based pricing? So how does it work for, like, from an org perspective for the customer's end use case?
Yeah, so we are a billing infrastructure company, which means you send us your usage data, you put in your metrics, your pricing model, and we aggregate that and generate your invoices for you. So sometimes we can help with pricing conversations just because we've seen it, but we certainly don't recommend per se or tell you exactly how to price. I think you're right that there are companies. I think Intercom is one. I think Zendesk is going in this direction where, you know, they'll charge you a dollar amount only if the support ticket gets resolved, right? And I think there's pros and cons to that. I think on one hand, it's very easy for their end users to understand, look, I got some value from this tool because like the support ticket got resolved. On the other hand, I think that's an example of like really divorcing from your costs. Like you could imagine, you know, Zendesk or Intercom does a bunch of work, even if the support ticket doesn't get resolved. And I think the jury's still out on those models, whether those will be the right way to price. And in my head, it's kind of a combination of managing simplicity with the actual value you're generating. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think we're still very, very early in that experiment.
So I'm curious, like, what do you see as most common right now? Is it like query-based or outcome-based? Like what's most popular?
Yeah, and honestly, AI companies look a lot like infrastructure companies in many ways, right? Especially at the lower layers. It's just compute and storage and some platform fee usually. One thing that I'll say is, as Matan was saying, almost every company we work with has some combination of either platform fee or seat-based pricing in addition to usage-based pricing. There are very few companies that are purely usage, or if they're purely usage, there's a commit component to them at the enterprise stage, right? So it's extremely rare for it to actually be pay-as-you-go. I think the fraction of revenue that is purely pay-as-you-go is extremely small because it's not predictable for the customer, it's not great for the vendor's finance team. There's all sorts of like volatility with that, and so we're seeing people pretty quickly move off of that model as their company matures.
Any other questions? In the back, going once.
How do you guys look at build versus buy, and like what's the decision process there?
Well, this is a great one. I think I had 2 calls about this one today. So this actually also relates to how you build your AI team as well internally. I think there is that tension, as I mentioned, within the organizations, depending on who you're talking to about kind of like what sarcastically I would call continuing education. But I think one thing that we saw that resonates really well, our goal here is not to replace your AI team. This is not what we're coming. Writer is the way we call it. We are essentially a solution versus a toolkit. Like what we're seeing a lot of people do, we come in, here's a solution. We have our own models, we have our own RAG, we have our own guardrails. Versus what happens with other companies, which is you need to start pick and choosing and duct taping it together, and then there's a lot of leakage on costs. But in no way, shape, or form am I, unless you're paying for it, am I building anything for you? Like your engineers still need to build and still need to interact with the models and still need to like do all of that. Again, unless it's in the contract and there is some component of professional service and so on. My view is now stepping away from writer and no longer being an ICPM is I would buy anything I can to get to market as quickly as possible. I think people in the Valley especially are too in love in building and forgetting that we need to prove our business. Prior, in my past history, I was at a company which some of you might know called Brex. Brex, what not many people know today, in the early days was built around Marqeta. Same as Ramp, which is also still built about Marqeta, which is fine because the goal was, it's hard to build a credit card. Let's get to market as quickly as possible, see that there's an actual business, but in parallel, negotiate with Visa or MasterCard or whoever to have direct relationships. So when and if we choose to, we can offload and restructure our cost structure. But if you don't have a business that's actually making money, it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. It doesn't matter that you built the best model in the world. It doesn't matter your R&D. No one's buying it. You're dead in the water.
Can I give an answer to this?
Yes.
I think there's like a right answer for build versus buy on a general version. And it basically goes like this. So imagine like you're in the 1920s and like cars are brand new and they can't go very fast. They go like 25 miles an hour or something like that. I don't know how fast cars go. And you have a really great engine. And there's a customer and they would like a car. And so like one option for you is that you could go sell to the car makers or you could make your own car. So does the car maker themselves, do they buy your engine or do they say, screw you, I'm just gonna make my own engine and like then you are that person, so you're the car maker with the engine. And the answer is that if your customer cares about how fast the car goes, that tells you whether or not you should build or buy. And the way this works is that at 25 miles an hour, you need to squeeze out the performance of every component piece that you have in your product tremendously. You have to really ramp that. And that means you need to build the engine, and you need to build the chassis, and you need to build the wheels, and like everything as much as possible, because that's the only way you're gonna get performance out of the whole thing. But the moment your car now goes more than 120 miles an hour, well, no one cares, because I can't even drive that legally. And so the moment you got the really good performant product, the market rewarded you with your customers who only care about leather seats. Suddenly, they don't want the engine anymore. They don't care how fast your car goes. And so that is a great time if you're making an engine to sell to car companies, because the car companies are all focused on leather seats, and they just want to outsource everything that is not the leather seat, which is now the thing that the customer cares about. And then it's a buy decision. Then it's a buy decision for them. Otherwise, it's a build. So you should look at what your customer actually wants, and you should ask yourself, does this help me get that performance? And basically do the same thing that we just heard, but yeah.
Any last questions? One more? Yes, Victor.
Thank you. Where do you see AI delivering most of the value today? We've heard about customer support, but are there any other obvious answers that perhaps are not necessarily in the spotlight?
Robots. Robots. Look, if people are training $100 billion models, or building these $100 billion data centers, it's not chatbots. It's material science models. It's the medical bio models. Maybe they will work and then produce one big drug, and you pay $150,000 for this drug that cures some major disease. And you sell it to 150,000 people, and you make $1 trillion, or so on, insurance, all that stuff. But physical world, robots, biomedical. That's where the money comes from.
Let's have each one of you give an answer in a couple of words.
I'll say in enterprise SaaS, it's been most interesting where it replaces, I wouldn't call it a whole job function, but a job of a function, the marketing agency example, right? Certain it doesn't replace the agency as a whole, but there are certain things they were doing, billing for clients, where now AI can just do that part. And frankly, they probably had a backlog of other things they want to get to, but that's a very clear end-to-end job to be done. And you can see the input, you can see the output, you can verify that's good, and a lot of value has been captured by how much that cost, right? So I would say that's the one. I think another interesting one is international translation kind of examples where it's a very niche thing, but cases where that is very useful to a company. It just touches on some really complicated manual processes today. So that's just been, I don't know, sort of fun to see. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I was allowed 2 words. So cogen is probably the biggest one, just developer productivity gains.
I was going to say cogen. I think one interesting one is I think initially sales and marketing content, there was real ROI, but I think that's an example of if you do so much of that as an industry, it just gets, it destroys all the value that you were previously generating. And so I think you have this weird curve there where now that's so commoditized that everyone's inundated with all this AI generated marketing content, and it's not clear how much value there is anymore.
I'll build on Josh and Evan and combine the two, actually. In the immediate term, where there's a lot of money, is going after things like what UiPath does. So workflow automation using AI. I think in the mid to long term, I think we don't know, and that's what's exciting. I think right now we pigeonhole the technology to what we know. So take this invoice and do something with it. Now that's not sexy, but there's a lot of money there. I think what starts becoming interesting is when we step away from the chatification of AI and move to where we're not yet, which is kind of push the limit. And we're starting to see it's definitely in robotics and other fields. Definitely not in SaaS yet, but there's a lot of opportunity there to rethink how the organization is completely built from scratch, how you do things in an organization.
Great. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, everyone, for coming.